Today is April 2nd, 2018, and I'm interviewing Claudine King as part of a collaboration between the Chilocco Alumni Group and the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program at Oklahoma State University. Claudine, you're a Chickasaw tribal member, a 1952 graduate of Chilocco. After graduation, you worked at Oklahoma State University, among other places, but you eventually returned to Chilocco with your husband, John David King. Both your contributions were recognized with the Citizenship Award from the Chilocco Alumni Association in 1972, and I look forward to learning more about your 30-year history with the school. Thanks for taking the time to talk with me.
Thank you. I'm happy to do so.
Where were you born and where did you grow up?
I was born in an Indian community down along close to the Red River near Lebanon, Oklahoma, about 5 miles north of there. And where I grew up is, I went to boarding school when I was 6 years old, and I spent 8 years at Carter Seminary. Of course, I was home down in Marshall County during the summers and at Christmas. But I grew up in a Chickasaw Choctaw boarding school at Ardmore, Oklahoma. What
did your folks do for a living?
Well, at the time I went to school when I was 6, very few people had jobs. My dad was finally able to get on with the WPA, but they lived out in a rural community. Very few people had any income. Mom was a housewife, as everyone else was then.
Any brothers or sisters?
Just the one sister. She went to Carter Seminary also. Mom and Dad in 1943, I believe, Dad was able to get a job working at Tinkerfield in Oklahoma City, so they moved there, and I continued to be enrolled in the boarding schools, was home in the summertime. Made lifelong friends at that Carter Seminary boarding school. I still hear from old roommates and friends from there on my birthday, on their birthdays. Learned a lot there.
That's special. What was your exposure to Chickasaw language and culture growing up?
Well, very little. My grandmother married Rich Williford. He was a white man, and she spoke Chickasaw, and she used a lot of the phrases, and when her cousins would come and her sisters, they would set all of us down on the front porch, and they would sing Chickasaw hymns. I learned a lot of those, but speaking every day, we all spoke English, but we could understand, at that time, when I was little, I could understand a lot of what they said. But that's gone away, most of it. Mm-hmm. However, one year when we went to a Chilocco reunion in Oklahoma City after the school closed, we were walking down the hall to leave the reunion, and it was Sunday morning, and they had a church service going, and there was a Chickasaw friend of mine up at the podium, and she was leading a song in Chickasaw, and I stopped at the doorway, and I remembered all the words. They came back to me, and I was really surprised. Been a long time, but...
How did you end up going to Chilocco?
In the boarding schools, they ask you about a preference of where you wanted to go to school. And there was Haskell and Chilocco and Sequoia, a few schools. But all my relatives, all the Willifords, had gone to Chilocco beginning in 1924 and through the years. And I still had 3 aunts in school at the time I was in the 8th grade at Carter. And I wanted to go to Chilocco because they told such wonderful stories about the place.
How old were you when you arrived there?
14.
And what were your first impressions?
How friendly everyone was. Everyone spoke to you, and there were 12 to 1,300 students there. I don't know that year. When our senior year, that's how many there were. I don't know about it. 1948 is the fall when I went there, and I don't really know about the number, but it was pretty. There were lots and lots of students from many, many different tribes, bringing all their own cultures, and it was a different world for me. I had not even at that point heard of a lot of the tribes that were there. Led a sheltered life.
And real intertribal education.
Mm-hmm. We learned to get along.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering what one of the hardest adjustments you had to make to Chilocco was.
You know, I don't really remember any because I had so looked forward to going. The harder adjustment was when I went to Carter Seminary. You know, at night it was, the cows coming home time in the evening. Mm-hmm. It was lonesome. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But by the time I went to Carter, that's the way my life was. Mm-hmm. Excuse me. Anyway, I had lots of relatives already there.
I was wondering if you had relatives already there.
Yes, several of my aunts one of whom was 2 years older than me, and one was another 2, and another 2. And so I had, and then a lot of the Carter Seminary girls that made the choice for Chilocco were there also, and they were almost like sisters. So I don't remember any major adjustment. I was just awed by how many students there were and all the facilities that were available and the activities. It was okay.
A big campus.
Mm-hmm. Very big campus. There were over 100 buildings there, I learned later. And it was like a small town because it was isolated, and we had a power plant and a fire department, and they provided the power and lights for the place. We had a swimming pool and tennis courts and a little shop where we could buy goodies, and it was a pretty self-sufficient place. The boys that worked in the trades worked on people's cars, the ones who had them. They made leather belts and purses for the girls, and in learning how to do that. There was a dry cleaning shop on the campus. We took our clothes there. Very nice.
Who were some of the teachers or administrators that you remember?
I remember L.E. Carell. He was the superintendent from 1926 to 1956, and that was what I call the heyday of Chilocco. He, along with others, made that a good place to be. He had a strong principle, and he made himself available to all the students. Every year at graduation, he encouraged those who were graduating to come back every year. At the end of last weekend in May, we'll be here. Come back, he said, and tell us what you've been doing. And that was, those were role models for the rest of us who were trying to find a place. And they would come back, and the next year, a different group would come. Every year there were graduates who came, and it became the very strong Chilocco Alumni Association. And those of us who were there looked forward to being a part of that.
So the school itself kind of had been having the reunions for the alumni. They had some kind of welcoming back, sort of.
Yes, it had been going on for years,
Mm-hmm.
and it continued all the time I was a student there. And until the school closed, there was a reunion at the end of every May for all the graduates who wanted to come back from all over the country, and they did. They came by the hundreds, and it was that weekend was turned over to alumni activities, and it was very reassuring and inspiring in a way. You heard the stories about the guy that was, flying for the airlines, and about the one who had this good job. There were lots of distinguished Chilocco graduates. Doctors became doctors and judges, and one guy, he was a Cherokee, North Carolina Cherokee, and he took baking at Chilocco. And he later became an executive with the Krispy Kreme donut thing, you know. Those made those of us who were still in school know that we could do the same if we worked,
Right.
as they suggested. It was a place where they had discipline, where there weren't too many rules. However, my uncle ran off, this was in the late 20s, he persuaded my cousin to go with him, and he ran off, the two of them. And I asked him many years later why he left, and he said, well, they just had too many rules. And I don't think he ever found a rule that he liked. But anyway, my cousin he regretted leaving because there was such a waiting list for the school that you couldn't get in if you did that. So anyway, it was these role models that came back each year. They would have a big banquet for them, and you would hear the things where they were living and what they were accomplishing. A lot of them went back to their tribes and became tribal leaders. And that continued till the school closed.
Mm-hmm.
The first year after 1980, when the school closed, we had the reunion. We had to find a place to have it. So the association decided we would hold it in Tulsa. There were several alumni chapters all over the United States, and there was the Northeast chapter over in Chilocco, Cherokee country, and so they said we'll do it. So they rented a big hotel over there in Tulsa for that weekend for 3 or 4 days, and we had a wonderful time. There were about 500 Indians showed up from all over the place, and afterwards the chapter president, who was a good friend of ours, called Claudine. He said, "You'll never believe what happened to me today." He said, "I went in to be sure all the bills were paid and everything was back in order, and the guy told me that the owner of the hotel, or the manager, I don't know who, someone in responsibility wanted to talk with him." So Bill went up there, and the guy said, "I feel like I owe someone an apology, so I'm going to apologize to you." He said, "When we heard 500 Indians were going to descend on us, we hired 3 extra security teams for 4 days, and they stood around and did nothing." Anyway, that was our first experience of the reunion after Chilocco. They then held, some alumni association decided they would hold it in 3 different places. Oklahoma City one year, Tulsa the next, Albuquerque, because we had so many people from the Southwest.
Rotate a little.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad he wasted his money.
Well, he was kind enough to say so.
That was not, yes. What were some of your more memorable classes?
Had a very good math teacher. He was a Choctaw man named Thorne. I don't remember his first name, but he was very effective. I didn't know anything about algebra when I went there. Had a little bit at Carter, but very good English teacher. Her name was Mabel Walker. Where I really learned what was most helpful to me, I think, besides the academic classes. You chose an avocation when you went in there. You enrolled in something. They had like 45 shops or something. No, 22 different. That was the buildings. They had, I don't know how many. I'm just going to read this for you. They had all these avocations that you could choose: printing, baking, power plant operation, masonry, food prep, farming, dry cleaning, foundry, which was metal casting, plumbing, shoe repair and leathercraft, auto mechanics, dairy operation, printing, carpentry, electricity, blacksmith and welding, cosmetology, and animal husbandry. And home ec. I chose home ec. But you could, they gave you a 3-week period, which if you didn't decide you didn't like the one you had chosen, you could try another one for 3 periods, and the third time that's what you were doing. So half a day you went to academic classes, half a day you went to your chosen vocation. In that home ec class, we learned to make our own clothing. We had already learned some of that at Carter Seminary. When we were in the 4th grade at Carter, we had to make our own flannel pajamas, flat fell seams and all, in the 4th grade. So we had a continuation of our how to make clothing. I had 5 children. I made all the clothing, shirts for the boys, gowns for the girl, made my own clothes. And in that era, that was helpful because clothing cost a lot and it was not available like it is now.
Right. Were you aware of National Guard activities at the school?
Yes. My husband, whom I didn't know at the time, but he was a member of that Chilocco Sea Company. And we heard the history of the World War II group that we had 2 Medal of Honor winners from that group, from Chilocco Sea Company. And my husband in later years told me he was the sergeant, or anyway, he was in charge of some of it when they were getting ready to go to Korea. They were down in Lake Charles, I think, or somewhere down in Louisiana. I'm not certain of that. They'd been gathering them up down at this camp, and he said that the Chilocco boys were out playing basketball or something out in front of the, what do they call the place where the military camp, the house, anyway, whatever they were in. And he said next door in the next bunkhouse was, there was a man, one of the officers out there talking to a young white boy who was crying. And he consoled him, I guess, and he went back. And this man came over to Claudine and he said, "How is it that your enlisted members are out here laughing and talking and playing ball?" And he said, "I have so many youngsters who don't know one another, who've never been away from home." And Claudine said, "Well, these guys have lived together 24 hours a day for years. They are already bonded." And so it was a strong group. And the guy, one of the Medal of Honor winners, he said he didn't tell this when they interviewed him, but they asked him why he did it. And he said to the Chilocco group, "I did it because they were killing my brothers, and I was angry." And so because they did become like your sisters and brothers, we lived together 24 hours a day most of the year. And there were lots of accolades for that Chilocco Sea Company, both during, it was the 45th Division, and they were the only company in the Army, as I understand it, that was allowed by an act of Congress to have that little Charlie doll on their guidon. Because they were, said one time they were all Indians, and my husband said, "No, that's not right." He said, "We had 2 boys that were sons of Chilocco employees that lived on the campus." There were about 60 employees that lived on the campus during the era we were there. And anyway, they did well, established a name for themselves.
How did you meet your husband?
I don't know for sure exactly when I first saw him, because there were 1,300 students there and they were just everywhere. But I remember vividly the first time I saw him. I had been out with some of my Carter Seminary friends. We'd only been there about a month, and the harvest moon was out, and we decided we would sneak out, night hawking they called it, and we would go out and swing and go to the tennis courts. And so we went out there, and it wasn't very long till that Cherokee night watchman, but he had a reputation. that was 35 acres of school stuff there, and he could find you. Well, anyway, he caught everybody but me. Finally, I was the last one, and I was in the shrubs next to home 3, and he came, he said, "Time to come out." And he asked me, he said, "What you doing out here?" And I said, "Oh, the moon was just so pretty, and we just wanted to get out to the swings and the tennis courts." And anyway, we got grounded, of course. But it went all over the campus. And the next day at breakfast, when the boys were running down the center sidewalk to go to the chow hall, I heard someone say, "Hey, Moonlight!" And I looked and I saw this guy running through the deal. I can still remember the shirt he had on. And it was Claudine, or my John David, they call him. But anyway, he got my attention. That was the day, and I was a freshman, 14 years old. Well, I was 15 by then, but my birthday was in late September.
That's a wonderful story.
Well, they still talk about Moonlight in our family.
So then did you get to spend more time at a dance, or did you go to some of the dances with John David?
Yes.
Because they had the Saturday night.
Yes. One Saturday was a movie, and one Saturday was the dancing. And I loved the dancing. We went to the movies together. And he didn't like dancing as much as I did, but he would take me in. And I would usually dance with Clyde Brown, or I had some dancing partners that loved to jitterbug. But every Saturday night, they would play this song, "Good night, sweetheart. Well, it's time to go." He and I would dance that every other Saturday night.
And lots of supervision.
Oh, yes. They were strict. There were places, girls were restricted to the north end of the campus primarily. All the boys' dorms were down on the south. But, it worked. They let us socialize after school out on the oval. And they kept us busy with school activities, sports, and movies, and skating on Sunday afternoon. And they would take us into Ark City. I kicked the camera again. They would take us into Ark City on a bus. I guess it was once a month. I don't remember really, but if we wanted to go, you didn't have to.
So you only went home during the summers, is that right? Did you have
at Christmas
family
and
come
in the
see you
summers? Yeah. By then, my parents lived in Oklahoma City, and they still didn't have a car, but they were able to take care of, feed us and clothe us. And
right?
I started working when I was 15 at the Biltmore Hotel in Oklahoma City as an elevator operator. There were my aunt that went to Chilocco was already employed there, and another friend, and so I went and got an interview and got to run those elevators up and down all summer, so I was able to buy all my own clothes. And that was helpful to Mom and Dad.
Right. What's one of the toughest moments you experienced at the school?
I don't know if you want this on here, but when I was a freshman, because I was working as an elevator operator and making my own money, I was able to buy some clothing. And a lot of the kids couldn't do that. I mean, I lived in a place where I could get a job. Mm-hmm. But there was a Kiowa dorm attendant who decided, I think primarily because of the way I looked, but that I had too much money, and I didn't belong there, and so she went. I don't know who she filed some kind of a complaint about there were not enough slots, and here I was taking one, and I don't really know her basis for that. Mm-hmm. Anyway, they sent me home. I was traumatized. I had to go to school with my sister at this public school, and I felt like a fish out of water. Mm-hmm. anyway, it wasn't very long until a social worker came to the little apartment where we lived. And Nice and I were there by ourselves. Mom and Dad were both working, and we had roll-out beds in this little bitty apartment. And he came in and talked with me and looked around, and he said, "Would you like to go back to Chilocco?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, that's not a problem." So I was, actually my aunt though, that was employed there by that time, her name was Lucille Bearskin. And she went to Mr. Corral. I believe it was Mr. Corral. Anyway, and he got Mr. Muller working on it. He's the one that caused the social worker to come, and I got to go back, and that was a very brief time, but it was really hard for me because I did not know any world but that.
Right.
And that's really the only thing. It really didn't have anything to do with Chilocco. This lady got fired. She, I don't know what her motive was, but she was fired after that.
I'm glad you had a happy ending for you.
Yeah.
So, after Chilocco, well, your husband graduates before you, right? Because he's a year.
No, he didn't. He was
okay.
He was in the class ahead of me, but he was in the Chilocco Sea Company that was activated during the Korean War, and he was gone a year. And when he came back, he was in my class, and he couldn't get away.
Did you ride him while he was in Korea?
Yes. Along with several other guys that were in that class, you know, they would write letters to different ones, different girls, and I assume boys there, wanted to know what was going on. And there was a Cherokee guy named Aaron Crittenden that used to write to me regularly and send me some pictures of some of the things they were doing. And of course my husband and his brother were in that company, and they would write too.
And your friends also wrote. I understand that a lot of times students would write just to show support, the women students.
Yeah, they had lots of letters from home.
Yeah. So after you graduate Chilocco, what happens?
Well, I went to Hills Business University.
In Oklahoma City.
Yes, I was the valedictorian of the class. I always felt kind of bad. Brian LeClaire, a Ponca boy, was he was in the Company C. He was one class ahead of me, and he said, "I would have been the valedictorian of my class if I hadn't come back and been in your class." He was the salutatorian, and they always gave the valedictorian a scholarship to OU, and the valedictorian got one to OSU. Brian wanted so badly to go to OSU, and I got the scholarship, and I didn't even want to go there. I wanted to go to OSU. So neither of us went to where Brian, I felt bad for Brian because he really wanted to go to OU. But he stayed in the military, I think, or went back to the military, and he was killed in a Jeep accident in Germany. Anyway, I ended up going to Hills Business University to be an admin secretary, and got a job. I finished a little bit early and ended up grading papers, and one of the things that happened there that was a real shock to me was that when we first went there, they said, "We're going to teach you to be the best administrative secretaries," or they also taught the people that did the court reporters. You had to choose. You'll be irreplaceable. You'll just be so good. And so then when we got to when we finished the thing, they said, "Now that you are so good at your job that you're irreplaceable, when you leave, you can train your replacement so well that you won't be missed." And I thought, anyway, it motivated us at the time.
And was John David already working, or?
He went to work at Chilocco and the dairy, and I was down there. And when I finished, I moved back. We lived on the campus for 4 years, underneath the water tower, in an apartment. Had 2 children when we lived there. And then he decided he wanted to go back to school, so we moved to Stillwater for 8 years.
The first time you went back, what was it like to come back as an employee, wife of an employee? I guess you were raising your
Well,
kids.
I'd only been gone about 2 years, and
Mhm.
it just seemed like coming home. I knew all the people there, and
Right.
it was sure different not being a student, being an employee. But it was still a very good place to be for the students, and it was a very supportive place at that time. I wanted to tell you some of the stories of some of my friends and students, if
Sure,
that's possible,
sure.
because I think that tells the story of Chilocco. And because of the very active Alumni Association, those of us who were there knew well many of the older students who had been there before we came. And there were a lot of them who went away to make, successful lives for themselves. But I think about my cousin who, his dad was a drinker and a gambler, and he gambled away their house. And they split the kids up, lived with this relative and that relative, and they finally got them into Chilocco. And he took carpentry and masonry. And when he graduated, he went on to build 2 restaurant hotels along the Mississippi River and employed a lot of Chilocco graduates. And if it hadn't been for Chilocco, his life would have been quite different. And I think of Trent Tilley, who put out the Chilocco paper for a long time. He told me that his dad was a drinker, and difficult to live with. And by the time he was very young, he was out on his own. He said, I lived with this family and that family and this relative and that relative. And he said, when they told me I could go to Chilocco, I'd been with an Osage family long enough that I was speaking Osage instead of Creek. And he said, I distinctly remember after being at Chilocco 4 or 5 days, I thought to myself, I'm going to like it here. At least I know where I'll be tomorrow. Mm. And he became a success. He took printing. He became a successful printer. That's what he did all of his life. He spent some time in the military. Colleen's sister, when my husband was 5, he had no parents. His mother had died, and his dad, during the Depression, was able to get a job with Santa Fe, but only in California. So he went away, and my husband and his 5 siblings were placed with an uncle who became their guardian, and he was one of 17 people in a 3-room house with no utilities. And his sister, Ellen, went to Chilocco too. She became president of the Granite Monument Works. They put up that big marker there on the OSU campus. They do all those portraits in the Wrestling Hall of Fame. Were it not for Chilocco, that probably wouldn't have happened. And the guy that took the baking, did the baking and became a Krispy Kreme executive. He came from North Carolina because the schools near that reservation there, or that Indian community, only went to the 8th grade. That's why he came. We had 2, when my husband was working at the dairy, we were living on campus. We took in a couple of New York boys. They sent about 8 or 10 kids down here from New York when that boarding school closed up there. I can't think of the name of it. Most of them they placed up there, but they had some that they had no placement for, so they sent them to Chilocco. And these 2 boys worked for my husband at the dairy, and he would bring them home with him to our apartment. And we would feed them and check them out at the dorm on weekends and holidays and take them uptown sometimes. And I will never forget the first Christmas. My husband didn't make much money. We had 2 kids, and he said, buy them a gift and we'll have them over here for Christmas dinner. And so I went and got the cheapest things I could buy, a hairbrush and some gloves, and I don't remember the other thing. They came for Christmas dinner, and one of them, we had a good time, but one of them was very quiet all evening. And the personality boy got up and thanked us and left after going back to the dorm. And Merlin, who was very shy, finally he said thank you, and he talked a while, and he went back to the dorm, and there sat the one who hadn't said anything all evening. He was a short, pudgy at that time, about 14 years old, and he got up and he was standing in the doorway, shifting from one foot to the other. And he said, I want to thank you for this gift, this Christmas gift. It's the first one I ever got. And he just became part of our family after that. Both of them did. We were parents at Merlin's wedding, but they had no place to be or go, and were it not for Chilocco. And they both, Jimerson was a Seneca Cayuga out of Erie, Pennsylvania, and he went back up there and became the foreman in a toy factory, and then worked at the university there. One night in home training at Chilocco, he stood up and he said, when I came here, I was rough as a cob, and Chilocco smoothed the edges. And of course, his nickname became Corn Cob. But that's what they did for hundreds of Indians. They smoothed the edges so we could get out there and function in a society we didn't know too much about. Mm-hmm. There were lots of those stories. And then Crosco's story. He went to Uchi boarding school with my husband, and then they transferred to Chilocco. And his dad was a career military man and always gone. His mother had died, and Chilocco was his home. And he told us after the school closed, he said, I would like to be buried at Chilocco, but they won't let me, so I'm going to be buried at Newkirk, which is as close as I can get. That's the kind of feelings and loyalty that were generated by the school that was there, at least for the 30 years that L.E. Carell was superintendent.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing those. I know that, you worked at a title and trust company for a little bit, and then you ended up at OSU. Mm-hmm. You were working at one point as the head research secretary, I guess.
Yes.
And your husband was going to school.
Yes.
There. So when you went back that second time to Chilocco, then there's been a lot of years, or a number of years have passed, more years. What positions did you both take there, and what were some of the changes?
Well, he went back. He was persuaded by Dee Gregory to come to work in the dorm as a dorm matron. That was 1963 when he came back. And I did not go to work there at that time. I went to work here in Newkirk because we had 5 children. We had 4 children at that time, and they were in school here, and they could come home for lunch if I worked in town, and I could too. So I worked here at that Title and Trust Company for 8 years, I think.
Okay.
And then when they were older and able better to care for themselves, I got the registrar's job at Chilocco because it was better pay and more benefits. That was in 1973. And you are right, it was very different. When I was a freshman there, in the freshman dorm, well, first of all, there were probably 350, maybe 400 Navajo students brought in from the Southwest. 90% of whom, 95% didn't speak any English. And they had a special program there, a 5-year program for them, and they were allowed to learn as fast as they could and go at their speed to get through that 5-year program where they were taught the essentials to get into the high school regular high school program. The guy who came in bringing that painting for Colon for his 75th birthday, he was at Chilocco 9 years. He was a product of that 5-year prep at your own speed, get into the high school, graduate from high school. But there were then a lot of those, and I can only tell you about the girls' dorm because I was they had a house officer, 2 house officers for each floor, and the Navajo girls were put up on the 3rd floor because they just spoke Navajo mostly. We had some interpreters, but they had a much steeper learning curve than the rest of us. Those who were, bilingual or they did. We had one of the stories that I've told that I still remember vividly. They didn't have much water out there. What they had, they used to eat or drink and for necessities. And so here they came, and they didn't know how to use water to clean. They didn't know about showers, washing machines, any of that stuff. So Aunt Noy, the matron there, who was a graduate of Carter Seminary and a graduate of Chilocco, she was the house mother for the freshman girls. And she had us, once a week we would line them up and tell them, we would make them take off one of their underskirts, the nearest one. And we would show them how to do the laundry and how to do the showers. The house officers and the matron. They didn't like that much. But we did this for about three weeks, and then we stopped. Well, they started using the showers and the laundry room, and another 3 weeks went by, and we had, they called themselves, the people, and they called the rest of us the Indians. Well, we like to had a little war in there between the Indians and the people, because once they discovered it, they would get in the showers and just stand there, groups of them, talking in Navajo and standing in that water. They decided they liked it. Same thing with the washers and dryers. We couldn't get in there. And there was only limited time. On the weekends and then evening, you still had homework, and you just had a few hours there to get all that done. And finally, they had to post, the house officers had to take turns working in the shower and the laundry rooms to urge them to get out, just because there were Indians banging on the shower doors and yelling at them because they wouldn't get out, Anyway, I learned a lot of bad words and a lot of different languages down there. But that was the kind of adjustment that a lot of them had. And in that group, one of those guys became a state representative in Arizona and then was a state senator. And his brother became the head of the Navajo Business College on the reservation out there. I admired that bunch because they had a tough row to hoe.
Right, a lot of.
But they did it. And we had some outstanding graduates from out there. Mm-hmm. I got off the subject, I guess, but I can't remember what you asked me.
No, it's neat to hear a little more about that program. I think one of the things that's happening, like throughout the 70s up until the time that Chilocco closed, is that enrollment's falling a little bit. And then, as I understood from, say, talking with Jim Baker, there are more students who are coming to Chilocco, and sort of because there just aren't other options for them in public school. I was just wondering your thoughts on how the student demographics were changing.
Well, it went from that, where the 1,200 students with the Navajos who adjusted, the discipline was good, they were lots of opportunities. They took advantage. We had a strong alumni association who inspired people. We had a museum and guides club on the campus that showed visitors around. We had many, many visitors who thought the campus looked like an Eastern college.
So
but when we came back,
these are non-Indians coming in to look at the campus and enjoy.
Oh yes,
a
lot of them.
Mm-hmm.
And if you could only be in the Museum and Guides Club if you had a certain grade point average, because you had to go out of class to show these people around. I remember one day there was a black, they called me to go take these people around. We had a museum there at that time, and So it was a man and a woman and a young boy. He must have been 13 or something. I don't really know, but they were from New York. And so we were allowed 2 hours. So I took them through all of the shops where the guys were working, and we went through the home ec department. I did the tour that we were supposed to do as museum and guides people. And we got back to the car, and the guy was opening the door, and the woman and the young boy were standing with me back at the back, and she said, "But where are the Indians?" I don't know what she expected. Maybe teepees? Someone said, "What did you say?" And for the life of me, I have no idea. I was so stunned. She'd been surrounded by Indians for hours. Anyway.
Right. Now that was when you were a student.
Yes.
Correct? Okay.
Afterwards, going back,
Yeah.
that's what you asked me that caused me to reflect.
Well,
on
sort of as the registrar too. I was thinking you were really in a position to
Yes.
to be seeing some changes in.
Man, it was a drastic change for me. I was really surprised. But the biggest drop was the enrollment, because by then, a lot of the tribes who had been sending their students from Arizona and Alaska and up in the Northwest were better able financially to educate them at home, and of course that's what they wanted to do. So we didn't have as many coming. And it was an era, times had just changed everywhere, and most of the placements became, when I went to boarding schools, you had to be a proven quarter Indian, you had to be an orphan or a half orphan, or placement by a social worker, or a hardship, what they called a hardship placement. I was a hardship placement. I don't know about all my friends that came, but mostly, after I went back there, they were hardship placements. Kids that were not functioning well in the places where they were, who were in some trouble, considered relatively minor at the time, where they could have a better opportunity. But it was not the same. It was very, very different, and I was saddened when I went back. But there were some wonderful students there. They were just fewer and fewer and fewer. And of course the cost per student was just out of sight. And Chilocco closed because it had served its purpose, I think, for the times, because all the Indians, they encouraged them to make, the graduates, to make homes in the communities where they were. That's where they wanted their children. They were able to do that. So it was a success in that regard. So it became more of a place for children whose Indian parents wanted them there because they were having trouble with them, or financially they just weren't able to support them, something like that, Just the enrollment just dwindled away. There was less than 200 students there when it closed.
Do you remember the school board that, and I think Jim Baker came on as superintendent in '73 and put together a school board? I was wondering if you remembered.
Yes.
The school board.
Yes, I served on it for a time.
Okay, great.
And then
what were some of the issues the board was asked to think about or advise on?
It was the 5 tribes. I'm not going there. Mostly it was political stuff that went on, that very little of which concerned the students. I was on it for a time, but there was an objection because I was a student. I'd been a
former student.
Former student, and
Was it Chilocco trying to navigate through the 5 tribes that held the
Yes.
land in trust at that
Yeah,
point?
yes, and
Okay.
that was difficult. They weren't prepared. I mean, let's say that's not maybe the right word. Their knowledge of educational needs. They were expert maybe in other fields, but it was difficult to serve on that board for me. And but Jim did a good job with it, a pretty good job, best he could. And I know that the people that were on it strived to do what they could. That was not their field of expertise.
Well, and then there was the tragic death of the student who was killed. What kind of an impact did that have on the school morale?
Well, it got a lot of attention from the media and from the Washington, you know. I think that was one of the big factors that caused their attention to the school. But we had some, we had children there who had problems, and this boy, this boy who was killed, was a Ponca boy. And now I can only speak about this from my perspective. I don't know everything there, but my husband worked in the dorms, and this boy had been adopted when he was very young and raised by parents who loved him and gave him a good life. But he wanted to find out about his roots, and he wanted to go to Chilocco because a lot of his original family had done so. And he never quite fit. You know, it was not his world. He looked the part, but so he was hassled. And it got out of hand. It was really sad. And when I called my husband, he was in training in Utah at the time at the Federal Police Academy. And I called to tell him what had happened, and he asked me, he mentioned the names, and are they involved? They were.
Do you remember when people started talking about the fact that the rumors were going around that Chilocco was going to close, the Department of Interior was going to close Chilocco?
Yes, it was a sad time up there, and yet a lot of us knew that it was inevitable because of the drop in enrollment and the problems they were having with some of the students that were there. And some of the employees began to look other places for employment. So the writing was on the wall. It just was kind of a sad time for those of us who remembered the heyday of Chilocco and how much it had accomplished, and how many thousands of Indians that were had the edges smoothed by Chilocco and distributed around this country to influence their tribes in the areas where they were. One of my classmates led the Pima tribe for a time when he went back home. It was a downward spiral caused by a number of factors. You know, drop in enrollment, change in the times, the more ability of more of the tribes to educate their own children, and the fact that lots of Chilocco graduates were now able to keep their children at home and provide for them.
I wonder if there was also, excuse me, you know, Bellman was just a senator at that point, but he was very much a fiscal conservative.
Yes.
That was his whole agenda. So he was not exactly supportive of keeping the school open either.
No, he was
as I
not.
understand it.
But you know, I could see his point too. I didn't agree with him. I wanted it to be there, and my husband, Bellman, was not his favorite person. But I dealt with the figures and the numbers of the students, and the cost was just terrific.
Right.
And so it made sense to me economically what they were doing, but it was a heartache nevertheless.
But your husband had a different take on.
Oh, he did.
on
He just, well, his heart belonged. He helped so many young boys. They came to our house over the years, still do, some of them. And we kind of raised those two Seneca boys. We were their family. Every year at Thanksgiving we got a great big plant from the boy in Pennsylvania. We were Merlin's parents at his wedding. He lived up in Wichita. So he knew how it was going to affect these boys he cared about.
Right.
It was worse for him. I sat over there where I dealt with the paperwork, and could see how it looked on paper.
And I forgot to ask you about coming back to Chilocco as employees that second time in '73. In terms of the ratio of Indians to non-Indian employees and faculty, had that ratio changed by the time you came back? You have a native superintendent at that point coming in.
Yes, we did, but even when I was a student there were lots of Indian employees on the campus. Most of the teachers were, well, it was a mixture then, and I sure don't know the percentage at that point in time. It seemed unimportant. But when the school closed, there was many more Indian, we were called Indians then. There were many more Indians there than there were whites. The Indians outnumbered the white employees by quite a lot.
So, do you think that, in your opinion, what could have maybe been done to stop the closing?
I don't know the answer to that because that was discussed on the campus so often, and no one really had an answer. They hoped to get some students from some of the reservations, to come back, the ones that that were struggling. They had services there for them that were provided. I'm not sure there could have been anything. It had been, if something could have been done to continue the excellence of the school, it would have had to have been done some years before. I don't know that there was anything they could have done differently.
What did the Alumni Association try to do?
Every year, when they had gathered and had their meeting, which were in Oklahoma City or Tulsa or Albuquerque, there was talk about the concern for the condition of the school. But if you talked with the different tribal members who were there from many different tribes, their students had a good school now where they were. And so they had no solutions. It was just a general, they had all benefited from the school to the point where they now were independent enough to not need the school for their children or their grandchildren. And they had no answer either for us. Lots of discussion. They didn't want, what was a big disappointment for the Alumni Association was the fact that when it did close, the school was intact. And it was allowed to deteriorate to fall down, that just grieves my soul to this day. It was unnecessary because the people who had charge of it could have done something different, but they tried, I guess. I just hated to see it deteriorate like that.
So you've been pretty active, as I understand it, with the Alumni Association. What are some of the
Yes,
things?
that was more a case of proximity in all the years that we lived, when we returned here in 1964, the children and I, all of the employees that were on the campus and all of the local alumni were expected to help with the annual Chilocco reunion. And so on the campus there for, that was another 20 years that we were there. My husband and I, we helped set up things and plan things and welcome the students coming back. And so I got to know lots of students from eras that before I went to school there, because they returned and they would, so it became, and then when I lived here at Newkirk, I still helped up there, went to the meetings and helped with the alumni things. And so we've been active in it simply because we were here and able to do so. And in fact, lately, even in the last few years, we would go up there, the few of us that are left in this area, and clean up the campus area there and around the student union, and rake and weed and mow, all that stuff, trying to get ready for the Alumni Association people to come in. And we were all getting up. I'm 84 years old. We were all getting where we hated to get up on ladders and wash the windows in the student union. And then last year, when they did allow us on there, but they had a contingent of Marines there, and it was almost a relief to me when we went on the campus. Man, it was spick and span, and they had weed eated, and all the windows were clean, and we didn't have to do it. Because we're getting, actually, the Chilocco alumni, I've had death notices of 4 in the last 2 months. 5.
Oh, my goodness.
And we're getting to be an endangered species. There's very few actual graduates left because it's been, close to 80? Almost, gosh, long time. Anyway, a lot of the people active in the Alumni Association are still those who come from far, but they bring their families where they didn't used to. Yeah. I took my daughter and 2 grandchildren to Oklahoma City one year when we had it there, and we were going down the hall, and Allison looked down that long hallway and she said, "There's Uncle Pedixie down there." And we all looked at her because he was supposed to come the next day. And we said, "Are you sure that was Pedixie?" She was about 10 and her brother was 13. Anyway, she said, "Well, it looked like him. He had on a blue shirt and he had gray hair." And before she could finish, her brother said, "Allison, they all have gray hair." And that was a real shock to me. But I thought, man, she is so right. This Chilocco clan that gathers is getting up in years. Very few of us left.
What is your, when you're not working them like you are, or after you finish working, what is your favorite part of the reunion?
Oh gosh, that would be difficult to answer. It's not an activity. It's getting together with all your old friends, people you haven't seen for years, who have to introduce themselves to you and you to them, and to hear about their lives. And again, it's a picture or mini portrait of the value Chilocco was for so many Indians from across this country. And that's what I like, is visiting with my old friends. But you know, as that last year, when I went to the powwow. I was ill on Saturday and couldn't attend, but I went to the powwow and stayed much longer than I meant to because there were lots of old friends there, you know. And there were only 2 from my class, 1952. There used to be 20 or 30 of us every year, and every year it would be a different bunch, you know. There were 91 people in my class, and wow. Anyway, we're fewer and fewer.
And you chose to stay at Newkirk, even though...
Well, when we moved back, I was working with this research group at OSU, and 2 of the petroleum men were working with Conoco in Ponca City on research projects, and they said they could guarantee me a good job at Conoco. And so I kind of wanted to live in Ponca City. And my husband had already come up the fall before. He had an apartment in Ark City, and he said, well, I'd like to live in Ark City. So we went up there to look at Ark City, and we just found we couldn't afford it because at that time you had to buy all the textbooks for your children. And we had 4. This was the compromise, Newkirk.
Okay.
Because he refused to live in Ponca City. And I understand not having my kids subjected to that, he said. So we lived here in this little town of Newkirk. When I used to go through here on a bus going back to Oklahoma City where I lived for the holidays, I would think, who would live in a little town like this? And I've been here for,
Well, you
gosh, a long, long time.
have a beautiful home here. Is there anything else we should talk about that we haven't mentioned? Anything you think you'd like to add? Or?
I can't think of anything. I've made those speeches. Did you find that DVD? I think
didn't.
I've got some more if you
That'd be
really
great.
want one. I just when my husband was nominated for the Hall of Fame award, he became ill and had a very short time, less than a month after he was diagnosed, and so he was not going to make it. And he said, "You can accept it for me." And I said, "Well, what do you want? What shall I say?" He said, "Well, tell him I learned a lot there, and I found you there, and it was a good place to be." And I said, "Okay, what else?" And then he talked a little bit more about how much he had learned from all of the different tribes about the different cultures, and he said, "I learned from so many Indian tribes I didn't even know existed at the time," and about how well, said, Chilocco taught me everything I needed to know to make a living in the world out there. And he said he was grateful for that. Anyway, I did the best I could to accept that award, and it was tough. But all my children were here, and that was helpful.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's a good note to remember Chilocco. Thank you.
Let me ask my daughter. Laura, is there anything you think of that I've left out that I should have said?
No, aside from the fact that a lot of the children of my age group who had parents that went there and or worked there really still feel a pretty strong connection to that, because that was our social life as we were growing up. And I remember it was predominantly Indian employees and their families, and that's who we had social gatherings with outside of the work hours. And a lot of them are very active in the Alumni Association now.
Right.
And I've not been because I've lived out of state, but it's had an impact down through
An
generations.
intergenerational impact.
Very
Right.
much so, I think.
That's
And, even my children have heard lots about it and can see the impact it's had on their grandparents.
You know, that does remind me that at the powwow the year before my husband died, the head man dancer got up and he said, I want to recognize someone who's here. And he talked about my husband and particular and Clara Bushyhead in the girls' dorms, who helped us all. I can't remember exactly what he said, but he said they kept us on the path. And I know that he just had so many accolades from so many of the young people who went there. And one of the things that I noticed at that powwow was how many of the dancers and the singers, when they got their awards or whatever, they would mention their parents or their grandparents who had gone to school at Chilocco. And when I accepted his speech, I asked the children of those two Senecas that we took in, I asked them to come. And they were, because Merlin and Jimerson both told us that they would have had a hard life if it hadn't been for Chilocco. And their children had become successful. Again, that it was generational benefits. Their daughter was a social worker for a tribe on the West Coast in Washington, and one of them was a foreman for some big shipping place, Albertsons or something, and then the other girl was a nurse. And I just know that their dads would have felt they would never have been possible if it weren't for Chilocco. So I forgot about the generational benefit.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Claudine.
Yes, down memory lane.